In the pre-dawn hours of March 2, 2010, Darien, Illinois, an unremarkable suburb southwest of Chicago, became the unlikely epicenter of a triple homicide. The town, defined more by its cul-de-sacs and commuter quiet than by crime, hadn't seen a murder in over a decade. That changed at exactly 3:32 a.m., when a 911 dispatcher received a call that shattered the silence. The voice on the line was soft, barely a whisper. Angela Kramer, 21, reported that someone had broken into her family's home. She was hiding in her bedroom closet. She believed her parents and brother had been shot. Responding officers arrived at the Kramer residence, a well-maintained two-story suburban home on a tree-lined street. At approximately 3:38 a.m., entry was forced through the rear sliding glass door. The glass pane shattered inward. There were no immediate signs of a struggle in the main living areas. Nothing appeared stolen. No electronics missing, no valuables disturbed. Yet 3 members of the Kramer family lay dead across 3 different rooms. Victims: Jeffrey Kramer, 50, the family patriarch, located in the upstairs hallway, 1 gunshot wound to the head. Lori Kramer, 48, his wife, found in the master bedroom, 2 gunshot wounds to the torso. Michael Kramer, 20, their son, discovered in his bedroom, shot multiple times at close range. No defensive wounds. No signs of physical resistance. Whoever had entered, entered with purpose. Whoever fired the weapon, fired to kill, cleanly and efficiently. Angela Kramer, still in shock, was escorted from her hiding place in the closet. Her younger brother, Anthony Kramer, 16, emerged from the basement where he had hidden after hearing the initial gunshots. Both survivors were physically unharmed. Preliminary examination of the crime scene by Darien Police and the DuPage County Forensic Unit highlighted the calculated nature of the attack. The shattered glass suggested forced entry, but there were no muddy footprints, no apparent struggle. The shooter moved methodically, shooting, retreating, leaving no physical trace of their presence beyond the bodies and broken glass. One point of interest: a partial shoe print near the broken glass. Size 11, male, consistent with a standard athletic shoe. Directional analysis suggested entry and exit through the same point, no deviation. Whoever had entered had done so decisively. A 9mm shell casing was recovered in each of the 3 rooms. The shooter had not used a revolver. The weapon was likely semi-automatic, possibly equipped with a suppressor based on witness testimony from Angela, who described the sounds as pops rather than loud reports. Ballistic analysis would later confirm that all 3 victims were shot with the same firearm. At this stage, no neighbors reported hearing anything unusual, no alarms triggered. The Kramer home, like many in suburban Darien, was not equipped with external surveillance. No immediate leads surfaced from the surrounding area. Angela's initial statement introduced a potential motive. She was in an ongoing custody dispute with her former boyfriend, Johnny Borisov. The pair shared a young son, and the conflict over visitation rights had escalated in recent months. Angela reported that Borisov had made threats against her and her family, though no formal restraining order had been filed. The possibility of a connection between the custody battle and the murder surfaced almost immediately in the investigative notes. Still, there was a problem. Borisov had an alibi. At the time of the murders, cell tower data placed his phone at his residence, and there was no evidence of him leaving that location overnight. His electronic footprint aligned too neatly with the expected timeline. As one investigator noted in the report, the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem. In forensic investigations, clean data could be as suspicious as a crime scene without evidence of struggle. Real life, unlike television crime scenes, is rarely this tidy. Angela and Anthony Kramer were moved to protective custody. Forensics swept the house for trace evidence. The murder weapon was not recovered at the scene, and no DNA outside the immediate family was identified on initial sweeps. By sunrise on March 2, 2010, the crime scene at the Kramer residence had transitioned from chaos to controlled examination. With the physical layout documented and the bodies removed for autopsy, attention shifted to the unseen layers, the data points, the relationships, the cracks beneath the surface of what, until that morning, had seemed like an ordinary suburban family. The DuPage County Coroner's Office initiated autopsies at 9 a.m. Jeffrey Kramer's cause of death was confirmed as a single gunshot wound to the head at close range. The angle of entry suggested the shooter had approached directly, aiming with precision. Lori Kramer sustained 2 gunshot wounds to the torso, both fatal, with stippling present on the skin, indicating the shots were fired from less than 2 feet away. Michael Kramer, the son, was shot multiple times, including defensive wounds on his forearms, unique among the victims. He had been awake, possibly alert to the intruder before his death. Each autopsy revealed consistent ballistic characteristics: 9 mm rounds, hollow point, designed for maximum tissue damage with minimal overpenetration. The weapon had not been recovered, but the consistency of the wounds and the shell casings linked the deaths conclusively to the same firearm. Serial numbers on the casings were standard factory issue, no identifying marks, no fingerprints recovered. Whoever had loaded the weapon had worn gloves. Forensics shifted focus to trace evidence. The partial shoe print identified near the shattered rear door remained the most tangible clue from the scene itself. Investigators processed the tread pattern through national databases, narrowing the shoe to a common model: Nike Air Monarch, size 11, a mass-market athletic shoe, widespread enough to yield no immediate leads. With no DNA hits, no murder weapon, and no direct surveillance footage from the Kramer residence, investigators expanded the perimeter. They canvassed nearby homes, checking doorbell cameras, security systems, and any recording devices that might have captured movement before or after 3 a.m. One neighbor's garage camera, facing a partial view of the street, offered the first external data point. At approximately 2:58 a.m., a dark-colored sedan passed by the Kramer home heading south. It reappeared in the same frame at 3:17 a.m., traveling northbound, matching the window of the murders. Vehicle make and model could not be confirmed due to low resolution, but preliminary analysis suggested a late-model Toyota or Honda, dark in color. It was a lead, but not much of one. Attention turned back to the Kramer family's personal connections. Angela Kramer's statement during initial questioning raised the first viable motive. She was engaged in an ongoing custody dispute with Johnny Borisov, her former boyfriend and father of her young son. Angela described escalating threats from Borisov in recent months, directed at her family, and her stability as a mother. Text messages provided by Angela supported claims of verbal harassment, though no physical violence had been reported. Importantly, no restraining orders had been filed, and no criminal complaints had been documented. On paper, the conflict between Angela and Borisov existed, but remained legally invisible. Investigators subpoenaed Borisov's phone records and financial transactions. His cell phone pinged from his residence throughout the night of March 1st into the early hours of March 2nd. Bank records showed no activity inconsistent with his alibi. However, investigators noted a history of cash withdrawals in recent weeks, several $1,000s unaccounted for, all withdrawn in smaller increments to avoid detection thresholds. It wasn't enough to indict, but it prompted questions about whether Borisov had the means to involve someone else. A deeper dive into Borisov's known associates turned up a second name, Jacob Nodarsa. Nodarsa, age 23, had prior connections to both Michael Kramer and Borisov through social circles and shared hobbies, including poker. Nodarsi had no significant criminal record, but his name surfaced during witness interviews as someone who had grown increasingly reclusive and unstable. Friends described him as off in recent weeks, withdrawing from regular activities, exhibiting signs of paranoia. Further scrutiny revealed that Nodarsi had left Illinois the morning after the murders, driving alone to Florida. This cross-state movement immediately flagged him as a person of interest. While flight alone was not proof of guilt, it was inconsistent with an innocent party's behavior following a high-profile homicide of people he knew. Law enforcement coordinated with Florida authorities, locating Nodarsi's vehicle outside a motel in Sarasota. A preliminary check confirmed the car matched the make and model seen in the neighbor's surveillance footage near the Kramer residence. The vehicle was dark-colored, a 2005 Toyota Camry, registered to Nodarsi. Back in Illinois, the digital forensics team extracted location data from Nodarsi's phone records, which, despite being turned off during critical hours, placed him in the vicinity of the Kramer home on the evening before the murders. A gap of 3 hours from 2:30 a.m. to 5:30 a.m. showed no activity, suggesting the phone had been powered down or disabled during the time of the killings. That silence was the most damning evidence so far. By the end of the second day, the investigation shifted from processing the physical scene to assembling a network of connections. A clear picture began to form. The Kramer murders were not random, not opportunistic. They were precise, calculated, and executed by someone with knowledge of the family's routines. Angela's testimony, the forensic evidence, and the digital footprints pointed toward a premeditated act, but not yet toward a definitive suspect. The absence of the murder weapon, the use of a mass-market shoe, and the untraceable car still left gaps that needed closing. On March 4, 2010, Jacob Nodarcy's vehicle sat idle outside a Sarasota motel. His cross-country flight had drawn to a close without resistance, but the act itself carried weight. Interstate evasion following a homicide was a calculated risk, and in the eyes of investigators, that alone placed Nodarcy squarely within their focus. Inside the vehicle, authorities recovered a single duffel bag containing clothing, a cell phone charger, and a legally registered 9mm handgun. Initial examination of the firearm revealed it was clean, too clean, no blood, no fingerprints on the barrel, slide, or magazine. However, ballistics testing was ordered immediately to compare against the shell casings recovered from the Kramer crime scene. The results would take days, but the chain of custody began here. Jacob Nodarcy was taken into custody without incident. His demeanor oscillated between detached and visibly anxious. He offered no resistance, but neither did he volunteer any information. By procedure, Florida law enforcement transferred him into the custody of Illinois authorities for questioning. During the transport and initial holding period, Nodarcy displayed clear signs of psychological distress. Medical evaluations indicated severe anxiety, disorientation, and sleep deprivation. Despite these conditions, he was deemed fit for interrogation. The first formal interview occurred 48 hours after his arrest. Nodarcy initially exercised his right to remain silent. His legal counsel emphasized that no statements would be made, but Nodarcy's body language contradicted the facade of control. He avoided eye contact, his hands trembled, and his responses to basic questions, name, date of birth, current address, were stilted, rehearsed. Investigators shifted focus from direct confrontation to establishing inconsistencies in his timeline. Phone records, financial transactions, and GPS data presented a clear picture of his movements leading up to the murders. On March 1st, Nodarcy's phone pinged near the Kramer residence. Surveillance footage captured a vehicle matching his on the street adjacent to the Kramer's home. His abrupt departure from Illinois the following morning coincided too neatly with the homicide timeline. With these points established, investigators re-engaged on March 6th. Nodarcy's attorney allowed limited questioning, provided the focus remained on clarifying Nodarcy's movements, not the crime itself. The investigators, methodical in their approach, outlined the discrepancies. Nodarcy had no verifiable reason for being near the Kramer residence on the night of March 1st. His vehicle's route out of Illinois followed a pattern consistent with flight, not routine travel. His financial records revealed cash withdrawals in the days leading up to the murders, though his usual spending patterns suggested no intent to travel. The questions were structured to highlight the growing incongruities between his alibi and the forensic evidence. Nodarcy remained largely non-responsive, but his composure weakened as the session progressed. His silence, combined with observable physical distress, provided leverage for investigators to press further in subsequent sessions. Parallel to these interrogations, forensic analysis continued. The handgun recovered from Nodarcy's vehicle was matched ballistically to the shell casings found at the Kramer crime scene. This confirmation linked Nodarcy directly to the weapon used in the murders. Additionally, trace residue tests on the interior of the Camry identified gunshot residue on the steering wheel and door handles, suggesting the weapon had been discharged prior to or during the period Nodarcy occupied the vehicle. Digital forensic teams uncovered deleted text messages between Nodarcy and Johnny Borisov in the weeks leading up to the murders. Although fragmented due to deletion, the partial data indicated a sustained pattern of communication, often encrypted or coded, suggesting a shared knowledge of impending actions. The messages were enough to warrant a deeper investigation into Borisov's role, but remained circumstantial at this stage. On March 8th, Nodarcy's psychological state deteriorated further. During a medical check, he expressed suicidal ideation, prompting increased observation. This vulnerability provided investigators with a final opening. The third interrogation session, conducted under strict observation, presented Nodarcy with the compiled forensic evidence: ballistic matches, gunshot residue, surveillance footage, phone records. The cumulative weight broke his silence. His initial statement was disjointed, erratic, but he acknowledged being present at the Kramer residence on the night of the murders. He admitted to entering the home. He described approaching the rear door, breaking the glass, and moving through the house with the 9mm handgun. He did not provide a motive. He claimed he acted under coercion but refused to elaborate further. Jacob Nodarce's partial confession placed him at the Kramer residence on the night of the murders. His admission aligned with the forensic data, ballistic evidence, gunshot residue, surveillance footage, but key details remained incomplete. He acknowledged pulling the trigger but introduced a new element to the investigation: coercion. He claimed he had not acted alone in motive, only in execution. This chapter of the investigation pivoted away from physical evidence and into the psychological framework that surrounded Nodarce. His statements suggested external pressure, someone orchestrating the crime from a distance. Investigators revisited his connections, and the focus inevitably returned to Johnny Borisov. Borisov's digital footprint revealed consistent patterns. His phone records, financial activity, and known movements placed him physically distant from the crime scene during the window of the murders. However, the recovered fragments of deleted text messages between him and Nodarce, though incomplete, indicated communication beyond casual acquaintance. Forensic teams requested a deeper analysis of Borisov's communications. Subpoenas extended to his email accounts, encrypted messaging apps, and financial ledgers beyond what was initially reviewed. This phase of the investigation uncovered a clearer picture of a sustained relationship between Borisov and Nodarce, centered around manipulation rather than friendship. The financial review highlighted a series of cash withdrawals by Borisov, totaling $4,500 over the 6 weeks preceding the murders. These withdrawals were structured to avoid bank reporting thresholds. While circumstantial, the cash flow suggested potential payments for services rendered, possibly an informal retainer for an illicit act. Further, encrypted messaging apps revealed that both Borisov and Nodarce had communicated through secondary channels outside standard SMS or email. Though the contents of these encrypted messages remained inaccessible due to end-to-end encryption, the metadata, frequency, duration, and timeframes showed heavy usage in the days leading to the murders. Specifically, the highest message volume occurred between February 27th and March 1st, 2010. Parallel to digital analysis, behavioral profiling of Borisov was initiated. A comprehensive review of his interactions with Angela Kramer highlighted a pattern of controlling behavior. Interviews with Angela's acquaintances described Borisov as aggressive, possessive, and prone to issuing threats when challenged. While no formal complaints had been lodged, witness statements from Angela's friends and family documented his increasing hostility during the custody dispute. Investigators corroborated these accounts with Angela's own statements, which revealed repeated threats from Borisov to end the fight once and for all. These threats, while non-specific in content, aligned temporally with the surge in encrypted communication between Borisov and Nodarce. At this stage, the forensic strategy shifted toward establishing the means by which Borisov might have influenced Nodarce. Experts in coercion and manipulation were consulted to assess the plausibility of Nodarce's claim that he was acting under duress. Psychological evaluations of Nodarce documented a history of anxiety and susceptibility to influence, particularly by dominant personalities, a profile consistent with someone vulnerable to external pressure. The analysis concluded that while Nodarce had agency in committing the murders, his psychological state made him more likely to submit to coercion. This provided context, but not legal absolution. By March 12, 2010, the accumulation of forensic, digital, and psychological evidence justified issuing a warrant for Johnny Borisov's arrest. He was taken into custody at his apartment without incident. The warrant detailed charges of solicitation of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and 3 counts of first-degree murder under the theory of accountability. During Borisov's initial processing, he declined to answer questions, invoking his right to counsel. His legal team immediately contested the warrant, arguing that there was no direct physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. However, the forensic case did not rely on physical presence. It was built on communication patterns, financial transactions, and the testimony of Nodarce corroborated by forensic data. With Borisov in custody, investigators prepared to confront the next phase, building a prosecutable case that could hold in court. Following the arrest of Johnny Borisov, the investigation entered a critical phase. While forensic evidence had directly linked Jacob Nodarce to the crime scene, Proving Borisov's role required demonstrating influence, connecting his intentions to Nodarcy's actions through verifiable channels. The prosecution faced a complex task, securing a conviction for a man who had never been physically present at the crime scene. The primary objective was to consolidate the existing evidence, financial records, digital communications, psychological evaluations, into a cohesive argument that Borisov had solicited and orchestrated the murders. The defense strategy became clear early. They aimed to isolate Borisov from the crime by portraying Nodarcy as mentally unstable and acting independently. The prosecution began by refining the timeline. Digital forensic analysts reconstructed the communication patterns between Borisov and Nodarcy in the 6 weeks leading up to the murders. While the contents of many encrypted messages remained inaccessible, the metadata, timestamps, frequency, and duration formed a distinct pattern. Analysis revealed that message traffic between the two surged during periods of heightened conflict between Borisov and Angela Kramer, particularly as custody hearings approached. This correlation supported the theory that Borisov's communications were tied to escalating tensions. Moreover, financial analysts confirmed that Borisov had withdrawn over $4,500 in structured increments during that same period. Surveillance footage from ATMs verified his presence at multiple cash withdrawals, eliminating the possibility of unauthorized access. These cash movements aligned temporally with Nodarcy's own financial inactivity, suggesting a potential off-the-books exchange. Supplementing this digital and financial framework, investigators secured testimony from individuals within Borisov's social circle. 2 acquaintances recalled conversations in which Borisov expressed frustration over the custody battle. One witness recounted hearing Borisov say that Angela wouldn't know what hit her if she tried to take his son. Though indirect, these statements provided context for his mindset, reinforcing the prosecution's narrative of premeditated intent. A critical layer of evidence came from Nodarcy's psychiatric evaluations. Court-appointed psychologists documented his vulnerability to external influence, citing his anxiety disorder and history of compliance under pressure. Nodarcy's statements during these sessions reiterated that he felt trapped by Borisov's threats, not only against himself, but also against his family. While the defense sought to discredit Nodarcy as unreliable, the psychological profile established that his actions, though criminal, had been manipulated by a dominant figure. Borisov's defense team filed multiple motions to suppress key evidence, including the digital communication metadata and psychological evaluations of Nodarcy. Their argument centered on the lack of direct content from encrypted messages and the perceived subjectivity of psychiatric assessments. However, the court ruled in favor of admitting these elements, citing their relevance in establishing a pattern of coercion and conspiracy. With the evidentiary framework solidified, prosecutors prepared for the pretrial hearings. Their strategy focused on illustrating 3 key points. Motive: Borisov's frustration and hostility toward Angela Kramer due to the custody dispute, means his access to cash, structured withdrawals, and encrypted communication with Nodarcy. Manipulation: his psychological leverage over Nodarcy, supported by forensic data and psychiatric profiles. The defense prepared to counter these points by emphasizing Nodarcy's mental instability and asserting that Borisov's communication with him, though frequent, lacked criminal intent. They framed the interactions as a product of shared social circles and personal grievances, not conspiracy. By March 20, 2010, the legal battle lines were drawn. Pre-trial motions were scheduled to address admissibility of evidence, with the prosecution positioning its case on a foundation of digital footprints, psychological manipulation, and circumstantial financial movements, all designed to portray Borisov as the architect of the Kramer murders. On October 2012, more than 2 years after the Kramer murders, the courtroom proceedings against Johnny Borisov commenced in DuPage County. The delay between arrest and trial allowed for extensive discovery, pre-trial motions, and mental health evaluations, but the essential structure of the case had remained intact. Borisov, though absent from the scene of the crime, stood accused of orchestrating a triple homicide through manipulation and coercion. The courtroom configuration was typical for a high-profile case. Jury selection involved careful vetting for biases related to organized crime, mental health, and domestic disputes. Both the defense and prosecution prioritized jurors who could weigh digital evidence and psychological testimony with objectivity. The prosecution opened by presenting the overarching narrative. Johnny Borisov, embroiled in a contentious custody battle with Angela Kramer, systematically planned the murders of Angela's immediate family. His alleged intent was to remove the barriers preventing him from securing custody of his son. Prosecutors acknowledged up front that Borisov did not pull the trigger, but emphasized his role as the architect of the killings. The first phase of the prosecution's case centered on forensic digital evidence. Cell phone records outlined the communication patterns between Borisov and Jacob Nodarcy over a 7-week period preceding the murders. Data analysts mapped out the frequency and timing of encrypted messages, showing spikes immediately before significant legal events in the custody dispute. The digital forensic team presented metadata timelines, cross-referenced with financial records, displaying the cash withdrawals Borisov made leading up to the crime. Surveillance footage from ATMs confirmed Borisov as the individual withdrawing the cash, eliminating doubts about the chain of custody for the funds. Next, the ballistic evidence linking Nodarcy to the crime scene was presented, not to question Nodarcy's involvement, but to frame Borisov's influence as instrumental. The prosecution established that the 9mm handgun used in the murders was recovered from Nodarcy's possession, and ballistic analysis conclusively matched it to the shell casings at the Kramer residence. This was not disputed. Instead, it reinforced that Nodarcy had carried out the killings, and the prosecution's task was to connect Borisov to the motivation behind them. The prosecution then introduced psychological testimony from court-appointed experts. These experts detailed Nodarcy's vulnerability to coercion, diagnosing him with generalized anxiety disorder and dependent personality traits. They emphasized his susceptibility to influence, particularly by dominant personalities, a profile that fit Borisov. This testimony was supported by Nodarcy's own prior statements, in which he described feeling trapped by Borisov's threats, both toward himself and his family. Witnesses from Angela Kramer's circle testified regarding Borisov's history of threats and controlling behavior. These statements, while circumstantial, aligned with the pattern of escalating communication between Borisov and Nodarcy. Friends recalled Borisov's increasing anger toward the Kramer family, particularly in the months leading to the murders. The defense countered by attempting to sever the connection between Borisov's communication and the murders. Their strategy emphasized Nodarcy's mental instability, portraying him as an unpredictable individual who acted independently. They argued that encrypted messaging patterns alone did not prove conspiracy, and that Nodarcy's psychological profile made him capable of violence without external influence. The defense also highlighted the absence of direct content from encrypted messages, focusing on the lack of explicit instructions tying Borisov to the murders. Without decrypted content, they argued, the metadata only demonstrated communication, not conspiracy. Despite this, the prosecution consistently returned to the correlation between communication spikes and legal conflicts within the custody dispute, framing Borisov as someone who had both motive and means to manipulate. As the trial progressed, Angela Kramer herself took the stand. She detailed the history of her relationship with Borisov, the ongoing custody dispute, and the pattern of threats leading up to the murders. Her testimony, while emotional, was structured around concrete examples of Borisov's behavior, documented confrontations, text messages, and attempts to control her actions. Through each phase, the prosecution maintained a focus on establishing pattern and intent, that Borisov's consistent involvement in the build-up to the crime demonstrated a clear, premeditated plan to remove the obstacles in his custody dispute by lethal means. As the prosecution neared the end of its case, the defense initiated its counteroffensive. Their strategy aimed to sever the perceived chain between Johnny Borisov's communication with Jacob Nodarcy and the act of murder. Without direct evidence, without explicit instructions or a clear financial transaction, the defense argued that any connection between the two men was speculative, based largely on assumption and inference. Their first line of attack focused on mental health evaluations. The defense presented their own expert witnesses, psychologists who challenged the notion that Nodarcy was coerced in a legal sense. These experts contended that Nodarcy, while struggling with anxiety and dependent traits, retained full cognitive function and the capacity for independent decision-making. They emphasized that mental health vulnerabilities did not equate to diminished criminal responsibility. In the defense's framing, Nodarcy was not manipulated. He acted on his own volition. The defense further emphasized Nodarcy's history of instability, drawing on past instances where he exhibited erratic behavior, including paranoia and withdrawal from social circles. Their narrative painted Nodarcy as a man capable of violence without needing external influence. This effort aimed to cast doubt on the prosecution's assertion that Borisov's communication patterns were linked to manipulation rather than mere association. Next, the defense scrutinized the digital evidence. Without the content of the encrypted messages between Borisov and Nodarcy, the defense argued, there was no definitive proof of conspiracy. They contended that communication frequency, while suggestive, did not establish intent or criminal plotting. They challenged the prosecution's focus on metadata patterns, claiming these were circumstantial and did not satisfy the burden of proof for solicitation or conspiracy. In addressing financial records, the defense maintained that Borisov's cash withdrawals were unrelated to the murders. They offered alternative explanations, suggesting that Borisov often dealt in cash for gambling purposes, an assertion supported by his known association with poker circles. The defense introduced testimony from individuals who described Borisov as a habitual gambler, often preferring cash transactions to manage winnings or debts. This testimony reframed the prosecution's timeline of cash withdrawals as routine behavior rather than preparatory actions for a crime. As the trial continued, the defense called Jacob Nodarcy to the stand. This was a calculated risk. Nodarcy had already confessed to the murders and implicated Borisov in earlier statements. On direct examination, Nodarcy was inconsistent. He reaffirmed his involvement in the killings but vacillated on the extent of Borisov's influence. At times, he described feeling threatened and pressured by Borisov. At other points, he admitted he could have refused, but didn't. The defense seized on these contradictions during cross-examination. They highlighted Nodarcy's wavering testimony, his mental health history, and his admission that he physically committed the murders without immediate coercion at the scene. They portrayed Nodarcy as an unreliable narrator, one whose story shifted under pressure and lacked the clarity needed to convict another man of conspiracy. Closing their case, the defense reiterated the absence of direct, conclusive evidence linking Borisov to the murders beyond association with Nodarcy. They framed the prosecution's case as one of circumstantial connections, correlations without causation. Despite these efforts, the prosecution maintained a consistent message. While Borisov's hand never held the gun, his influence directed it. They reinforced that patterned behavior, timed communication, and targeted manipulation were sufficient to establish accountability under the law. After nearly 4 weeks of testimony, expert analysis, and cross-examinations, the case against Johnny Borisov rested in the hands of 12 jurors. The prosecution had built its argument layer by layer: digital communication metadata, financial withdrawals, psychological manipulation, while the defense dismantled where it could, focusing on the lack of explicit directives and the instability of Jacob Nodarcy. The court recessed for jury deliberation on May 15, 2013. The jury received instructions carefully crafted to explain the principle of accountability under Illinois law. A person who commands or encourages another to commit a crime can be held equally responsible for the outcome. No direct presence at the scene was required, only the intent and actions that contributed to the crime. Jury deliberations extended across 4 days. On the first day, transcripts of Nodarcy's testimony were requested, followed by a review of the prosecution's digital forensic timelines. The jurors focused on the encrypted message patterns between Borisov and Nodarcy, asking for clarification on the correlation between message spikes and significant events in the custody dispute. They sought summaries of the financial records and ATM footage to confirm the timeline of Borisov's cash withdrawals. On the second day, the defense's psychiatric experts' reports were reviewed alongside the prosecution's psychological assessments of Nodarcy. The central question remained whether Nodarcy, under psychological duress, could be considered manipulated or if he acted independently, driven by his own instability. By the fourth day, a verdict was reached. The jury returned to a packed courtroom on May 19, 2013. Johnny Borisov was found guilty on all counts: 3 counts of first-degree murder under the theory of accountability, and 1 count of solicitation of murder. The verdict acknowledged Borisov's orchestration of the crime through psychological manipulation and material support, despite his absence from the physical crime scene. Sentencing proceedings began immediately following the verdict. Illinois law mandated life imprisonment for multiple counts of first-degree murder with aggravating factors, and in this case, the premeditated nature of the crime and the murder of multiple victims weighed heavily. Victim impact statements were heard before sentencing. Angela Kramer addressed the court directly, recounting the lasting impact of losing her parents and brother. She described the fear she continued to live with and the toll the legal process had taken on her family. Her words were concise, focused on the reality that the Kramer family's loss could not be undone by any sentence the court imposed. On July 19, 2013, Johnny Barizov was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murders of Jeffrey, Lori, and Michael Kramer. The additional conviction for solicitation of murder was merged into the life sentence under Illinois statute. Jacob Nodarcy, having pled guilty to his role in the murders under a negotiated agreement, received a sentence of 75 years in prison with eligibility for parole after serving 50 years. The terms accounted for his cooperation and psychological evaluations but acknowledged the gravity of his actions. The conclusion of the trial marked a legal resolution, but the psychological and emotional consequences extended far beyond the courtroom. When I look back on this case, what stays with me most is how control doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it's words, threats, and manipulation that lead to the deepest harm. The Kramer family never expected that someone outside their door, someone they once knew, could orchestrate such devastation without pulling the trigger themselves. That's why understanding emotional abuse, coercion, and manipulation is so vital. It's not just about what someone does, it's about what they make others believe they have to do. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to know, what's your takeaway from this case? Do you think justice was truly served? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And hey, if you found this video meaningful, hit that subscribe button and join me for more stories that uncover hidden truths and hard lessons. Even if you didn't like the video, I'm open. Tell me why, and share where you're tuning in from. Let's keep this conversation going.